Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the politics podcast that always scores in 90 minutes or under. I'm Andreou. On today's show, Rishi Sunak says life is better now than in 2010. And Nigel Farage says there are no racists in his party. We discuss what medication they should be on. And what are the implications of and possible lessons from the first round result in France for Britain and the world? Let's meet the panel. First up, it's historian and author Seth Thévoz. Hello, Seth.
Hello, Alex.
Seth, Biden somewhat rallied after his catastrophic first debate with Trump, but speculation about his needing to step aside has intensified. The Obamas and the Clintons have given public support, but is that basically giving him the space to make a dignified exit?
I would hope so. I should say from the outset, I'm a huge admirer of Joe Biden. I think actually he's one of the most consequential, if not the most consequential president of my lifetime. And I say that as somebody who's just looking at this impartially, regardless of whether you agree with his agenda or not. He has passed more legislation in the first 2 years of his presidency than any American president, certainly since Lyndon Johnson. That said, it was painfully apparent last week that the Joe Biden of today is not the Joe Biden of 2020 or even of 2022. And in a normal election, it wouldn't be the end of the world if the Democrats don't win the White House. They're up against Donald Trump. They can't afford to lose, and this is not a tenable way forward.
I heard one former congressman, a Republican actually, say that this year the Republicans have chosen the only candidate that could conceivably lose to Biden, and the Democrats have chosen the only candidate that could conceivably lose to Trump. Will Trump want him replaced, do you think? Because that will mean a certain amount of churn and sort of maybe internecine arguments among the Democrats, but on the other end of it, he might get someone quite dynamic and difficult to deal with.
I think Trump would quite like him to stay because he's weirdly obsessed with him. This is personal. There's an element of a grudge match about this. And Trump is someone who very much believes his own tropes and propaganda. He's obsessed with this riff about Sleepy Joe. And he'll have to find a new theme. You know, that's not like Trump.
And joining Seth is the New Statesman's associate political editor, Rachel Cunliffe. Hello, Rachel.
Hello, Alex.
You've got a big feature out in this week's New Statesman about who could be the next Tory leader. Into which direction do you think the party will move? Further to the right or back towards the Cameroonian centre? Like, what's your instinct?
What's the vibe?
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be really quite deeply split. Leadership contests in the Conservative Party tend to hinge on a binary left, right, pro-Brexit, less pro-Brexit. And the question that is going to be asked of all the candidates is, how do we cope with the threat of Nigel Farage and reform? Do we welcome Farage back into the party? Do we try and move closer to reform's positions? Or do we tack to the centre and try and win from the centre ground, which is what David Cameron did? And so much is up in the air with what the makeup of the party will look like, who's going to keep their seats. There are people who are being suggested as candidates who might not even manage to hold their seats, let alone manage to get enough of a support base. So we just don't know where the balance of power is going to lie. But I talked to various people, some on the record and some anonymously, and the general sense was parties that are hurt very badly tend to look towards their base before they're able to then try and build a broader coalition. So the odds are in favour of people like Priti Patel, Robert Jenrick, Suella Braverman, if she wasn't considered insane, Kemi Badenoch. You know, they've got the edge here.
And like you say, it's a weird one because you're not just trying to assess the sort of runners and riders and their support and their prospect. You have the added complication that many of them face battles to be re-elected in the first place. So it's a sort of weird 3D grid. But is that an opportunity too? Might bucking the national trend, let's say Penny Mordaunt bucks the national trend and does much better than the party in general, wins his seat again, does that then become a huge boost for her potential bid?
I think it would, because it's all about grasping the narrative, conducting the autopsy of what went wrong. And if someone like Penny Mordaunt can show that in her constituency she outperformed the national trend, she can say this is a version of conservatism that has widespread appeal. And that helps her make the case, or somebody like her to make the case, for tacking towards the centre. The issue is that it's so up in the air, and the Conservatives are facing so many threats from Reform, from Labour, from the Lib Dems, from the Greens, that you will probably be able to look at the results on Friday morning and build whatever kind of narrative you want. And obviously, if it's run according to past Conservative leadership contests, the final say will be the membership, and the membership tends to be more to the radical right than the parliamentary party does.
I have joined. No, I mean it completely. Because I thought...
Because you want to vote?
Absolutely. I thought, we will spend some portion of our lives with whoever is leading these people in whatever direction they take them. I want to have a say. So
who would you vote for?
I don't know who's going to be up for election, but whoever is up, there's going to be one slightly better, less mad option, right? Like, whatever two people you put together, they're not going to be exactly as bad as each other. God, I'm now thinking of all the possibilities where they are exactly that. Anyway, before we start, more excitement for election night. You know about our sold-out live show at the Tabernacle in London. You know about the live stream for Patreon people from 8:30 to 10:30. There's a link to sign up in the show notes. But what about afterwards? What happens into the small hours as the results start to come in and we see what the new government is really going to be like? And who gets Portilloed? We have the perfect thing for your long night in front of the TV. We can announce that a mix of Oh God What Now regulars and friends of the pod will be streaming live on YouTube all night long, from 10 p.m. into the wee hours of the morning. There will be much commenting on all the results and a good amount of schadenfreude, a sort of mix of Gogglebox and Jeff Stelling's Soccer Saturday. And it's free. All you need to do is fire up the YouTube app and subscribe to our channel as the results start to come in. That's Oh God What Now, your second screen companion for the biggest night in British politics of the decade. Sign up now. There's a link in the show notes, and we will see you there. We're up all night for good fun. We're up all night to get Rishi. Let's get to it then. Right after Jude Bellingham scored his equaliser at the very last minute of injury time, Rishi Sunak tweeted, "It's not over until it's over." The problem is politics, unlike football, is a sport in which the supporters determine the outcome, and half of Rishi's supporters left the stadium early to catch the Reform tram. Being interviewed by Laura Kuensberg, he insisted that life is better than it was in 2010, which I imagine is an easy thing to say for a man whose wealth rose, according to the Sunday Times rich list, by £122 million last year alone. But his nemesis, Nigel Farage, is having trouble of his own, claiming that a Channel 4 conspiracy is responsible for one racist volunteer in his party, while simultaneously suspending a string of employees and actual candidates. Rachel, Sunak seems to have found a late burst of energy. Farage is faltering, but with only a couple of days to go, is it just too late to turn things around in any meaningful way?
Yeah. Pretty much. I mean, you've got to remember that postal votes have gone out. Most postal votes, I think people fill them in within 48 hours. A fifth of people now vote that way. So
that's quite a big percentage.
It's quite a big percentage of people who have already made up their minds and cast their votes. A lot of the people who haven't, I don't think there's much that is going to change in the last couple of days before campaigning. I also don't really think that there's much that could have changed had Sunak been more energetic and more fiery earlier on in the campaign. I know he
might have annoyed us more, if anything.
I know he did better in that last head-to-head debate with Keir Starmer than he has done in previous ones, but still the Snap YouGov poll showed 50-50 people thinking that he won versus Starmer winning. And if you look at the way the Conservative poll ratings have just collapsed, I'm not sure Sunak's best being just about as good as Starmer would have had any kind of meaningful difference.
I only ask because we keep seeing bits of research after elections or referendums and things like that, that say loads of people decide at the very last minute, which seems just so weird to me. I refuse to take the information in. But we know there is a sort of slice of people that they literally go to the voting booth and go, nah.
Yeah, those are probably the same people who aren't aware that the polls are so heavily in Labour's favour. One of the things that has astounded me is talking to people outside politics, even people who sort of pay attention to the news and things, who go, do you think Labour are really going to win it? And I'm like, have you seen what the forecasts are? And they're like, yeah, but it's probably going to be a hung parliament light. And I would love to have been able to relax about this election enough to feel that way.
Just in support of that, I was speaking to a Tory activist a couple of weeks ago who was saying, well, the mask has slipped on Labour's tax rises, and I think actually Rishi's going to surprise us all with a Conservative majority. So the degree of delusion that is out there. Oh, yeah.
Not just...
He was saying a healthy majority, close to Boris's majority from last time around.
Listen, weirder things have happened.
Can I have whatever he's taking? Because that sounds fun.
Listen, something will happen on the 5th of July. Either the Conservative Party will be over or the polling industry will be over. It'll be one of the two. Both can't possibly survive.
It's really interesting looking at the MRP polls and the range of them. First of all, I think we've had too many polls this election. It just feels like they've been endless. But all of them are forecasting a huge Labour majority and the Conservatives having a really, really bad night. But the extent of that bad night, the range is quite big. It goes from 150 seats to 50 seats. And because they're all showing the same kind of headline result, Labour in government, there hasn't been as much discussion about what is causing that variation.
Sunak told Laura Kuensberg, as I said, that Britain is now a better place to live in than in 2010. Do you think there's any truth to that, or is it just more evidence of how out of touch he is with everyone else's life?
So the piece of evidence that Conservatives point to when they make that claim is 4 million more people in work now than in 2010. And they make the point that job numbers have risen, the unemployment rate has gone down, and the number of unemployed people in the UK has almost halved since 2010. That's the claim. And that there was a boom in jobs over that time period. If you compare that to the fall in living standards, the cost of living crisis, inflation, public services, all of that, it's quite a specific metric. And a lot of people, even if they are in that 4 million who are now in work, probably won't necessarily feel like their lives have got materially better. There is one metric, though, on which the life is better than in 2010, which is that we've got same-sex marriage. That was a Cameron-era achievement. True. And that is something that has made life materially better for thousands of same-sex couples. That's just not an achievement that the Conservatives like to point to when they make this claim.
Funny that. Now, Sunak spent 80% of his tenure listing his 5 pledges, going inflation, growth, debt, NHS, boats, which are really 3 pledges: economy, health, immigration. Campaign fog aside, is the real issue that he said, judge me on the results, and the results in all those areas are either unimpressive or actually getting worse? Like, clear everything away, because I think what Rachel says is true. These are the things that people notice in their everyday lives. And you can list statistics and job numbers and GDP all day long, unless people can get a GP appointment or feel their money's going further, they're not going to buy what you're selling.
I agree, although I think Sunak probably does view it in quite a technocratic sense in terms of what the figures are. But the reason we are having an election right now is that I think Sunak concluded that the news is only going to get worse on all 3 of these fronts. It's sort of widely expected that the boat crossings will only increase over the course of the summer, and it'll just be more embarrassing for him. There are questions about whether the Rwanda policy would even work or whether it would be overturned.
Seth, they're ready. The planes are ready. He said so.
Yes, exactly. And interestingly enough, I mean, I think there was a widespread expectation that the economic figures would be worse. It actually turns out that forecasts have been revised and there's a 0.1% upturn now in predictions of growth. But certainly when the election was called.
Yeah. The longer the election campaign has gone on, I think it seems to me the more desperate the attacks and the adverts and more negative they've got. Last week they published a poster with an image of a family being held up. Headline, "Don't surrender your family's future to Labour." Is negative campaigning a strategy to victory, generally speaking, or is it just base consolidation?
It can be both. I mean, the brutal truth is, unfortunately, we don't like to admit it, but negative campaigning works. John Major, a lot of his surprise victory of 1992, it wasn't just him getting on a soapbox and charming people to bits. It was this Labour's tax bombshell basically threatening people and saying you will be poorer under Labour. That slightly blunted an approach the Tories are trying to take now if everybody feels materially poorer under them and doesn't believe that they will be any better at all. The trouble with negative campaigning is that it naturally builds up resistance. We don't like the feel of it. And there comes a point where it loses its salience and you just switch off entirely.
Yeah. And you have to be, I think, you have to be a little bit whiter than white to use it, because at the moment anything you say about the other side sort of boomerangs to something that you're guilty of. And
to some extent, I think that,
like the tax line, every time it comes up in every interview, everyone points out that tax is higher now after 14 years of Conservatives than it's ever been before.
So voters are sophisticated enough to be able to say, you're not perfect and you're not perfect, but I'm still voting for you over you. That said, it gets ugly after a while.
Beth Rigby on Monday asked Starmer whether he was worried about getting a mandate that is wide but shallow. I think that's a really good question. Do you think if he's elected, he's likely to experience just a really short honeymoon?
I'm not sure he's going to get any honeymoon at all. And I think the crumbling of the Conservative vote, which is going to lead to Labour getting a much higher majority than expected. Obviously, that's a massive benefit for Labour, but it comes with risks as well, because on day one of a Labour government, a significant number of those Labour seats are not going to be really Labour seats, or they're going to be seats that kind of voted to get the Conservatives out, but they're going to be seats which in 5 years' time, or 4 or 5 years' time, it's going to be very difficult for a Labour government to hold. Yeah. So he's going to start off, Keir Starmer is going to start off with a very broad coalition, broad in terms of geography, broad in terms of demographics, in voter priorities, in income ranges, and in ideology. And it's going to be virtually impossible to hold all of that together. And I would hope that there are conversations going on in Labour right now that are saying, when we come in to government, we need to effectively write off some of these seats, because if we spend too long trying to please everyone, we're not going to be able to achieve anything. Yeah. And we're going to have to be prepared to make enemies, which is something Keir Starmer said in an interview with Nick Robinson on the BBC a few weeks ago. You're going to have to make enemies. You cannot keep such a broad coalition happy. Yeah. And the more you try, the more you're going to waste time.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, particularly because it involves some very candid conversations with MPs to say to them from day one, you're going to be toast in 5 years, but use your time well. And actually, if you have that expectation at the start of Parliament, it's perfectly manageable. It's if you kick it down the can and leave it to the last minute, people start getting nervous and angsty and saying, no, I can hold my constituency. I've got a personal following.
Yeah. My instinct tells me that people will want to see movement very quickly, not necessarily results, but they will want to see them doing stuff towards results. What about the Lib Dems? Ed Davey was bungee jumping on Monday.
Rather him than me.
If the polls prove right, they've had the best campaign of all, right? In terms of...
Yeah, so the Lib Dems, a couple of things have gone on with the Lib Dems. One is that they've been really smart about the seats that they're targeting. So in 2019, Jo Swinson said she wanted to get over 100 seats and she wanted to be Prime Minister. They ended up with 11 and she lost her seat. This time, Ed Davey has been, not explicitly, but there were clearly seats that they're targeting and areas that they're targeting. And they look on course to get 50 to 65, which would be like the best ever result. And everyone has sort of made a bit of fun of Ed Davey for the bungee jumping and this water slide and the paddle boarding and the what else was he doing? He was doing pottery at one point.
Yeah,
CPR.
CPR, like,
the CPR. Yeah, I love that.
But he is leader of a party that wouldn't be getting kind of any national attention, and he needs to kind of do stunts that will get him in the news, and it's worked. And he's looked like he's actually had fun. A really interesting question for me is that, like, sort of baked into the Liberal Democrat ethos is this idea of prioritising voter reform and proportional representation. If under first past the post they get 12 to 15% of the vote and end up with 65 seats, which is kind of about what proportional representation would give them, and Reform get a higher vote share and end up with 1 or 2 seats, are you going to see the Liberal Democrats from this new position of authority within Parliament going, great, thanks, now we'll work with Reform to get PR? Or are you going to see them going, yeah, we like electoral reform at some point, but we're actually quite happy with first past the post for now. Let's not be hasty. And I'm really curious as to what's going to happen.
Yeah. Seth, Labour seem to be leading the SNP, and I have barely heard anything about Wales. You know, the Vaughan Gething issue barely gets a mention. Northern Ireland has barely been acknowledged in a meaningful way. Has the hogging of the media limelight by unionist parties effectively actually squeezed Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish issues completely out of the debate?
Yeah, I certainly think that we've been focusing far too disproportionately on England in all of this. There are some really interesting dynamics in Scotland because since the SNP's breakout in 2015, there's been an interesting transferability about the unionist vote. You found generally Labour, Lib Dem, Conservative voters are willing to tactically vote for one another to stop the SNP, and the Tories have been beneficiaries of that, and they're not. And that's suddenly gone out the window and is going to do some really interesting things in seats. Wales, there are some interesting things afoot. You may well find that actually certainly Plaid may pick up at least 1 seat, possibly more. And Northern Ireland has some really interesting sort of slow motion demographic changes filtering through. We're now looking at, the story of the last decade was the UUP being replaced by the DUP. Now the DUP is looking to be eclipsed by Sinn Féin, and the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, as a non-sectarian party, is actually doing very well as well. So you're getting a really big shift in the shape of Northern Ireland politics.
Yeah. Let's turn to Reform. I don't want to, but we have to. 3 candidates were dropped by Farage over offensive comments in the last few days. Another, Liam Booth Isherwood, disowned Reform and is now backing his local Conservative candidate. How bad is this for Reform, do you think?
I mean, I thought the dissident candidates disowning them was actually pretty small fry in the grand scheme of things. It's interesting that the first thing they did was to cry foul and say, oh, well, he's infiltrated us. He's actually a Tory plant all along.
Well, like the Channel 4 stuff.
Exactly.
That is their go-to, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is the sort of conspiratorial mindset. Oh, well, it's clearly a setup. You've got actors who are planted and so on. But when you have things like Nigel Farage's Twitter account having uploaded to it a far-right German marching song, which he's now sort of saying, oh, that was just a mistake. I mean, a harmless mistake. I'm sure we've all uploaded Horst Wessel to Twitter by accident. The thing with Farage is that he insists on total control over the Brexit Party through this, really unusual model before it became the Reform UK as a company, because he said, I've had enough of this whole thing I had with UKIP where, dealing with committees, I was dealing with weirdos and oddballs, and I just need to install some order. Well, it turns out that in a party that he completely controls, he's not got much order, and he's not got much discipline on this.
And his excuse to Trevor Phillips on Sunday was precisely the opposite. Rachel, is this idea actually ideal for Labour, psephologically speaking, rather than the Tories squeezing the Reform vote or Reform clearly breaking through? Do they want the fight between Reform and the Tories to be so finely balanced that it just splits the vote as perfectly as possible up and down the country?
I mean, in a way, that's very efficient and it works in Labour's favour. Over the medium and long term, I don't think it is in Labour's interests at all for Reform to be a strong party, for Nigel Farage to return as a force in British politics. I think there's some really worrying trends when you look at the appeal among young people, 18 to 24-year-olds, for Reform. Not a majority, but like more than the Tories, and I think that's worrying. And I also think that when people like Nigel Farage are involved in the political discourse, they change the terms of the debate, they change the topic of conversation. And right now, that's Rishi Sunak's problem. It's going to be Keir Starmer's problem really soon. So yeah, they might get some extra MPs from it, but I think if you asked Keir Starmer to rub his magic lamp, would it be better long term for Reform to not be a force in British politics? He would, I'm sure, choose that, even at the expense of a couple of seats.
Seth, finally, a Sunday Times editorial endorsed Labour, somewhat grudgingly, I thought. It said the Tories have forfeited the right to govern, and that now was the right time for Labour to be entrusted with restoring competence to government. How important are such endorsements in reality?
I think these things matter less and less. I mean, the time of the 1997 Labour landslide, the Sunday Times had a circulation of 1.3 million. Its circulation at best is half of that now. But also, people just aren't that obedient as readers. You know, if you look at consumers of media, in the case of GB News, the single most popular party is actually Labour amongst their viewers, which you wouldn't believe. But even if you believe that these things do influence them, it's very late in the day. I mean, we're 3 days out from the election at this stage. People are going to have made up their minds, I think, more or less.
Yeah. I have to say, thinking back, the only such events I can remember is when someone flips very obviously the opposite way. They're the ones that are notable, and not because they affect voters, but because they kind of feed into a narrative that something is happening.
Well, I wouldn't underestimate the Star's endorsement of friend of the podcast, Count Binface.
I wouldn't do that either, but I mean, I think The Guardian going Lib Dem in 2010, I thought that was quite a significant thing, something that it felt like it sort of had an effect.
And the New Statesman didn't endorse anyone in 2019 and got, I wasn't there, I should say, but got a lot of flack for that from the left for not endorsing Labour under Corbyn. But that was a decision about the times we were going through at that point. I think that was quite statementy, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would agree that they don't, voters don't go, oh, my newspaper is saying so therefore I must vote X. But sometimes, they are notable parts of the narrative.
Yeah, I can tell you that something's going on.
Do either of you expect any more flippers among the big nationals?
I mean, most have declared at the time of recording. I know the Express hasn't and the Sun hasn't.
Well, I mean, we know who the Express like. It's in every single front page.
It's Count Binface again.
Yeah. It's some alien overlord with a bin for a face. Let's put it like that. Have the Sun declared? I don't think they have.
There is genuinely a question mark about whether they would, endorse Labour, and indeed a question about whether Labour would accept the endorsement.
Okay, so it's been a campaign packed with gaffes and scandals and slurs and water slides. We're oh so close to finding out the result. But if you were in charge of a party's campaign strategy, what is one thing that you would have done differently? I'm talking strategy, not avoiding a particular gaffe. So I will not accept staying at D-Day for the whole day, because that's, a magic 8 ball could tell you that. I will allocate parties to you at random. Rachel, you have Labour, because I know you spend your time following the Conservatives and the housing statement. Seth, you take the Lib Dems, and I will take the Conservatives. So we're all either painfully outside or painfully inside our comfort zones. So
my thing that I would have changed about Labour's campaign is I think they could have done a better job at laying the groundwork for what comes later. I completely understand the Ming Vase theory of elections, that you try not to make a mistake, you're carrying this precious thing across a polished floor, you don't want to break it. That all made sense to me 2 months ago. It doesn't make sense now. And some of the continuing to be very clear about sort of tax rises, seeming to rule out council tax, seeming to rule out increases in capital gains tax. I think Labour has, tied their hands behind their backs for governing, and they didn't need it to win a significant majority. And I think somewhere along the lines, I would have gone, you know what, we're going to win this. We're going to win this big. We don't need to make life this much harder for ourselves when we're in government.
Yeah. So they're going to end up in Downing Street with a Ming vase instead of a mandate, is what you're saying.
That's a nice way of putting it.
How about you, sir?
I very much
Your brief is the Lib Dems.
I agree with what Rachel was saying earlier about the Lib Dems generally having had quite a good campaign. But I think one thing they could have done more was to far more explicitly embrace tactical voting. There's a lot of very nimble, suggestive...
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Exactly.
We're not putting resources into these seats.
It's straight out of the 1997 playbook, and it's, we have exchanged lists of target seats behind the scenes. We're never going to publish them. We're never going to be open about this. But actually, we all know this is going on. It's blatantly obvious. And I think it would be more compelling, actually, for tactical voters, both in the Labour and Lib Dem seats, if they were able to say, we've got a paper candidate, but we're not actually putting up a serious fight here. Just vote for here, here, and here. I think most people would welcome that sort of clarity.
Yeah, maybe even just for a handful of seats that are sort of special cases, like to get this particular hate figure out or whatever.
And there will be a handful of seats which really are three-way contests where Labour and the Lib Dems are really at it like ferrets in a sack.
Yes, I was looking at one yesterday where there's one point between all three of them.
But I think it's helpful to be open about that, and it's helpful to be open about that for the other seats. Well, that's not the case.
Yeah. So
you've got the Conservatives.
I got the Conservatives. Very simple. I would have called the election a year and 2 months ago. I am utterly baffled by this notion that having promised things, these 5 pledges that were plainly going to depend on outside factors, and some of which were contradictory to each other, it baffles me that they thought we can go through a summer of boats arriving and the insecurity of the economy. There was a point when he had done the Albania deal and numbers went suddenly right down in terms of small boat crossings. He had achieved the Windsor framework, and all the economic indicators had started moving the right way. The NHS waiting lists have gone slightly down. There was like a golden opportunity round about April, and he just missed it. And I am baffled as to why he missed it. What do I know? Next up, we've had an influx of questions from listeners. Remember, you too can have your question answered by simply becoming a Patreon backer, and then you can send us your question. So first up, it's a question from Ellis Pratt. Does the Rejoin Closer Links movement need a figurehead in the way that the Brexiteers had Nigel Farage? Back in 2019, Ian Dunt predicted that a Rejoin movement would start to emerge after we formally left the EU. Why has that not really happened yet?
I think this is a really interesting question around a figurehead, and it's not one that I had thought of before reading Ellis's question. So thank you, Ellis. But I was thinking kind of what has happened since 2016, and the closest thing we've had to a figurehead was probably Gina Miller, who brought the sort of court case, and it didn't really go anywhere. And no offense to Gina Miller, who I think is very accomplished in a number of ways, but she's not exactly a populist rallying sort of figurehead. I think if there was going to be somebody to lead the Rejoin closer in movement, it would probably be someone like Jeremy Clarkson, because I actually think Clarkson's farm, where he sort of talks about all the extra regulations on farming because of Brexit and the things that they can't do, it is, a really compelling case for closer links with the EU, but a compelling case in terms that resonate in kind of unexpected ways.
And he's seen as very much as part of that side of politics as well.
Yeah, he's not one of the usual suspects. He's not this is not an ode to Jeremy Clarkson in any way, but I think there is the risk that any figure emerging, you could hear the accusations, elite, out of touch, don't understand normal people, don't understand democracy, don't understand what led people to vote for Brexit in the first place, patronising. You need somebody who can cut through all of that. So my feeling would be Jeremy Clarkson or Taylor Swift, who I know is not British and doesn't care about Brexit, but, I feel like she'd do a good job as well.
As a close proxy, may I suggest Hannah Waddingham, who I think could sell anything to the British public at the moment, and they would buy it.
I'm a bit more sceptical on this. I'm not a fan of...
You don't think Taylor Swift could do it?
No, it's no reflection on Taylor Swift. It's about personality cults, which is what I think figureheads risk becoming on this. And I don't think personality cults work very well in politics, actually, particularly if a political movement is centered around that. You see a bit of that, actually, with Gina Miller. Again, I'm a huge admirer of Gina Miller, but she's gone off, found her own minority party, which is a fringe,
which is not doing
best,
making any progress at all.
And even the Farage, for all his success in some ways, he still has this problem. He is a one-man band. His party basically is structured around him going to do rallies up and down the country. But that's it. If Farage doesn't turn up, then there's no show. There's nothing going on.
It's a sort of thing that works in presidential systems like America or France, but not so well here. Right, next question is from Colin Baines. And Colin asks, are there any reverse Portillos, not sure this is the right moniker, that's Colin saying that the panel would admit to, a Tory they would be disappointed to see lose their seat?
I'd actually find it hilarious if, in spite of it all, Steve Baker kept his seat, because he's so visibly just given up and stopped caring now.
I think that's his strategy.
He said that if he manages to keep his seat, he's running for the leadership.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but I think that's
and he'll have to go through with it now.
I saw Steve Baker the day after the election was called, and I said, how are you feeling about it all? And he's like, I'm going parasailing in Greece. I was like, good for you, Steve. There are some Conservatives who are not standing, who are standing down, that I am kind of sad about. Robert Halfon is one. I think he has been a very good MP in Harlow and has done... really cares about education and skills training and has sort of focused on that throughout his time in Parliament, and I really admire that. Also, Mike Freer in Finchley and Golders Green, who's standing down because of the death threats and harassment and the fact that his office was suffered an arson attack. And I just think that I hope that Finchley Golders Green has a Labour MP. It's not the constituency where I grew up. I've met the Labour candidate. I think she's great, but I just think somebody moving out of politics for that reason is not great and doesn't say great things. But in terms of actually answering the question, the MP that I would be really sorry to see go is David Davis, because I think he's just hilarious, and I think he is a maverick voice in the Conservative Party when it comes to things like civil liberties and voting rights and freedom of expression and stuff, that kind of feels quite at odds with the wing of the party that he inhabits. And because he's been an MP for so long, since the 80s, he has a bit of weight in that, and I think it'd be nice to keep him in the party.
Oh God, no!
Alex is looking at me like I'm absolutely insane.
I do not know what is wrong with you sometimes. David Davis.
He's really, really good fun.
Sure, but he's also Pratt. I mean, he's the Pratt that started us down the negotiations path that, it was almost doomed from day one. I mean, on day 2 of the negotiations, he agreed to the EU timetable. They could not believe their luck because he was completely unprepared and proud of it.
But when all those anti-royalist protesters got arrested at the coronation,
No, I agree.
David Davis was there speaking against his party.
He frequently says things that are counterintuitive from someone like him.
Yeah.
And I do like him for that, but he's also a prat.
I have a lot of time for David Davis. I agree. He was actually a hopeless minister, but as an active backbencher, somebody who takes on these very unpopular causes, I mean, you need only look at what he's been doing on lawfare, for example, and on libel reform, for instance, in the last few years.
Yeah, and he takes on cases that are unpopular sort of as an aspect, as a point of principle. And he has said to me, if I don't do it, nobody will. It's very easy to defend the popular.
So he is not someone I'd want in government, but he is absolutely someone I'd want in opposition as a backbench MP.
You're outnumbered, Alex.
Davis has fans, evidently. I think for me it would be maybe Caroline Noakes. I think she has been honourable and decent in the vast majority of her dealings, has spoken on issues that she feels strongly about. To me, she represents sort of the last remnants, not even actually the evolution of what Cameron was trying to do back in 2010 almost. She's a few steps further forward than that. She strikes me as someone who is basically fiscally conservative, but progressive in almost every other way, which I can respect. Give me a minute while I grieve the country I once knew, the British-French journalist Myriam François wrote, as results from the first round of the French legislative election started to filter through. She went on, "Tonight every French person should bow her head in shame at what decades of normalization of racism has facilitated. Marine Le Pen in the arse is finally within touching distance of some real power via her protégé, also her niece's partner." Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Jordan Bardella. Her party, Le Rassemblement National, the National Front until recently, achieved 33% in the first round, with the alliance of leftist and green parties coming second with 28%, and Macron's centrist outfit third on 21%. How big is this moment? How will it shake out in the next round? Can she be stopped? Should she be stopped? And what are the implications beyond France? Seth. Strangely, I had to do a little bit of digging this morning to find those actual results, right? Behind the breathless hard right on the march headlines. I was surprised to find that RN actually performed below polling predictions. 33 is what they got in the European elections and their PR. And the Left Alliance did quite a bit better. What do you make of the result in the round?
I think we should be a bit calm and sober rather than some of this sensationalized coverage that we've had, because yes, it's true, they have almost doubled their popular share of the vote since the last National Assembly election. So they went from 18% to 33%. But that said, this isn't crossing the Rubicon in some way. The last presidential election they had, in the final round, they got 41% of the vote. Yeah. And then in popular vote terms as well, they're on 10 million votes now. They got 13 million votes beforehand. So they're doing very well, yes, alarmingly well, but this isn't necessarily unprecedented territory just yet. What it does mean is that they will most likely be the largest party in this parliament. It's a little bit difficult to tell because of the way that the voting patterns work out when you get to the second round. Usually, the normal way that French politics works out is actually the far right and their predecessor parties tend to do less well on the second round than in the first round. Their vote preferences tend to go down because of tactical voting against them.
But they're not usually up against the sort of leftist alliance.
Yeah, I mean, it works in different ways. What has been breaking down, though, is voter deference to sort of have voter pacts against this. It used to be the boogeyman that no more than 5% would vote for, and then it was no more than 15% would vote for, and then it was no more than 18% would vote for. It has been growing and growing and growing. There are pacts that are ongoing, just as we're recording this, that are being brokered, so it does look like there may be a sort of popular front against them, including more than two party
so
blocks.
Just to give some data on that, first of all, the horse trading period is very short. Candidates, I think, have to put their papers in by tomorrow 6 p.m. Ipsos analyst Mathieu Gallard calculated that the first round had left potential for three-way contests in 306 of the 577 seats, so that there is a lot of deals to be done. The thing that jumped out at me was, and I haven't seen this reported very much, so 39 Rassemblement National MPs have already been elected because they got more than 50% in the first round, including Marine Le Pen.
Though where they were winning was in the bits of the northeast and the southeast that have been their strongholds in the past.
That's absolutely right, and I will come to that when we discuss the potential parallels with the UK, because I think it's very interesting. So RN had never done that before. They had never won a single MP in the first round by getting more than 50%. So I think that is quite notable. Bardella has said that he will not take the position of Prime Minister or form a government unless he has an absolute majority. How does that complicate things?
Quite considerably, because there's a decent chance that he won't. They will undoubtedly benefit because they have a sort of variation of first past the post in France, even with this two-round system. But it could well be that they end up being the largest party refusing to participate in government. Now, that's interesting because their whole pitch has been, we're outsiders, we're trying to break the system. And that increases their chances of saying we're being locked out of the narrative, all the other parties trying to gang up on us. That might actually work in their favour if they play it that way.
Yeah. I mean, in a very different context, it is sort of what Tsipras did in Greece just before he got elected. He refused to form a coalition, basically, and stayed as opposition. And at the next election, he got quite a healthy majority. So maybe that's the gambit. Rachel, Macron called this election knowing his party was polling very poorly because, as I said, these stats basically reflect what happened in the European parliamentary elections. What was he hoping to achieve, do you think?
I think Macron is one of those politicians who knows he's very clever and sometimes thinks he's a little bit more clever than he actually is. So I think the gamble was twofold. One was if we go to the country now after the European elections, I'm basically saying to the French voters, put your money where your mouth is. Yeah. You've had your little protest vote, but come on, get serious. You're not really going to vote for these guys again, are you? We all know you're quite sensible, really, French people, right? Turns out French people, like other electorates, don't like being lectured in that way.
Well, let's see what happens in the second round.
But I think that was part of the calculation. The second part was the presidential election is coming up in 2027. And I think there was an argument that if we get a messy hung parliament with the far-right party as the largest party, but it's not properly governing, but everything's a mess, but can it form a coalition or not? Then by the time you get to the presidential election, you've kind of taken the wind out of their sails because people will have seen, well, they were in government and what did they achieve?
All mouth and no trousers.
Exactly. Which it could go that way. Equally, it could go the way that Seth said a moment ago, where they refuse to participate in government and they can play off the narrative that they have been locked out and that the French establishment has denied the people their democratic voice. So I think that was what was going on in Macron's head. I know a lot of French political adjacent people and commentators of the centre right, centre left, who really think it was very, very arrogant. His own prime minister is really furious with him. And I think there was a bit of ego in there as well.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see, but I suspect there is a vanishingly small possibility, but a possibility nonetheless that in 3 years' time, we'll be talking about what a strategic genius this move was, because it is possible that he read the tea leaves and they said, if I wait, then we'll lose both the parliament and the presidency in 3 years' time by a big majority to the far right. So.
Well, if Macron is listening to this podcast, I think that is exactly what he wants people to think of him.
Right. Seth, we've already seen some protests in Paris. Doesn't that play right into Le Pen's accusations that the leftist metropolitan elite are not real Democrats and they just throw their toys out of the pram unless they get their way?
I'm not so sure. I mean, France has a long, long history of popular protest on the right as well as on the left, and neither really has a monopoly of these things turning ugly. I think the French electorate is actually quite desensitized to the idea that you get protests around election time.
Paris actually spurned Rassemblement.
Very overwhelmingly, yeah.
All its candidates were eliminated in the first round, and 9 of its 18 seats were won by the New Left coalition outright by getting more than 50%. So, I mean,
but then
the feelings are quite clear.
But the Rassemblement National is very much overwhelmingly a rural party if you look at their real electoral base.
Yeah, and I also find it very interesting that French stocks and the stock market and the currency really rallied at the result. It had taken a battering, and the results came in a lot less bad than markets expected, which I think is also quite notable. So less talked about, but I think just as important, Seth, is the complete collapse of Les Républicains, the French equivalent of the Tories, basically. They're down to 10%. It is there, I think, that I begin to see possible parallels with what is happening in the UK right now. Are we getting a glimpse of Britain some years down the line if Starmer fails to deliver?
Quite possibly. I mean, I think their final results ended up being worse than you mentioned. The exit poll was 10%. They actually polled about 6% on the final results. And what that means, firstly, is even if we take that analysis into account, there's less for the Front National to squeeze.
Yeah.
It used to be the case that the left and right would sort of divide along equal lines. 33% plus 6% equals 39%. You combine the 28% of the left bloc and the 21% of the centrist bloc, that's 49%. It's 39 to 49 for the two blocks. So it's by no means certain that actually the far right will
Because you mentioned the Rassemblement, it really swept the sort of Hauts-de-France.
Yeah.
The France region, which is, I guess, northern, slightly depressed former industrial regions, really the French equivalent of what we call the Red Wall. And they had mostly voted left before. The actual leader of the Communist Party, Fabien Roussel, lost his seat there, which was held by the communists for over 60 years, to a Rassemblement National candidate outright won more than 50% of the vote. I mean, that is just an astonishing turnaround, right? And I look at that and I think Starmer, having dragged the party towards the middle, if he gets into Downing Street and fails to deliver for, those kinds of seats in a very palpable way, are we looking at reform sort of sweeping those northern?
It depends on whether new parties are seen as viable vehicles. I mean, firstly, it should be said that Rassemblement National, although it's a relatively new party, actually it's a continuation of the old Front National. It's been around for decades.
Yeah.
And there is a bit more fluidity between the French parties. So it used to be the Républicains and the Socialistes. Well, 10 years ago, we were talking about how the Socialists were a bust game, they were totally done for, partly because Macron centrists, 2-1, their support actually came from the left rather than the right. And they basically hollowed out the French Socialist Party. Well, the French Socialist Party, as part of this wider leftist bloc, is back in a big way now. So yes, the Républicains are very depressed because their popular vote has gone over to the far right. It has to be said that there's been a lot of overlap for, it's not even a recent thing, for 20 years now. There's been, really since Sarkozy, there's been an element of trying to outflank the far right by adopting their rhetoric on immigration and so on. And that is, again, where your analogy comes right into this.
Rachel, what about lateral effects directly on the UK? I was thinking, what happens if Le Pen comes in, adopts, for instance, a much more hostile attitude to asylum applicants, and then we suddenly see a surge of small boat crossings in Starmer's first month.
So I think Starmer's team are watching this really closely, and they had worked very hard. David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, worked very hard to build links with Macron's team. That's why Starmer and Lammy were at the D-Day commemoration event, which Sunak left early because they had built those relationships, and they haven't had time to build relationships with Le Pen and her team. That said, there are areas where you can see a Labour government working with Le Pen if they're in power. She has said in the past that she is in support of the Security Pact, the Lancaster House Agreement, which is an agreement between the UK and France. And given that one of Labour's key pitches for how it would tackle illegal immigration is closer cooperation with countries in Europe, you can see agreements taking place. You can see sort of work on a bilateral level. And Labour are not naive about the global framework that they're going to be in office dealing with. We got a big interview in the New Statesman this week with David Lammy about going to Washington and meeting a whole load of people who are likely to be key in Trump's second administration if that is what happens. So obviously it would be preferable if Labour were in power with Biden in the US, Macron in France, that progressive alliance. But they are doing a lot of work to try and...
And there is a scenario, right, where we end up with Trump in the White House and Le Pen as president. And what does that do to things like EU cohesion, to things like NATO? I mean... We are suddenly in a very alien environment.
The NATO dimension is huge because certainly Marine Le Pen's policy in the past has been to disengage from NATO, to go outside of its command structure. It's not to leave altogether, but it's so sufficient doubt that something like France's participation in the nuclear deterrent that's actually at the centre of NATO would suddenly, I think, be called into question. Now, if you suddenly call into question America's commitment to that as well at the same time, well, what's left by way of a nuclear deterrent? Britain's contribution is there, but it's not a huge one.
Yeah. And what about the Meloni effect, Rachel? You said, already Le Pen has indicated that she's willing to stick by the deals. There is a pattern of far-right politicians coming into power and sometimes becoming less extreme in some ways, somehow becoming subsumed basically by the consensus, as it were. Are we seeing signs from Le Pen that she might move in that direction, or are we heading sort of for dystopia?
I think she has already softened her language on various things, and there are figures on the French right that are to the right of Le Pen, and she has tried to position herself as the acceptable face of that political movement. I think maybe hard right as opposed to far right would be the terminology. I think what's happened with Meloni in Italy is you can campaign with radical populism and that will get you support and get you votes. And then it turns out that once these people are in office, the trappings of the office do change them. They want to be taken seriously by world leaders. And the sort of consensus, I don't think it's so much consensus establishment politics. It's you're going to the G7 and you don't want to be the kind of fringe figure on the end who no one wants to talk to.
That is completely it, right? You see it in their personalities, that they're suddenly incredibly flattered that they're there at the top table. They're seduced by that.
And they want the follow-up invitations. They want to go to the White House. They don't just want to meet people at summits. They want to get the full treatment.
And with that, we've reached the end of the show, so it's time for escape routes, and we need them after that segment. What's keeping us all sane for now with the general election well within sight? Seth, let's start with you.
whenever there's a presidential election in the offing, I rewatch a fantastic film of play from the 60s called The Best Man. It's scripted by Gore Vidal. It's about a deadlocked US presidential convention between two deeply flawed presidential candidates. And every time it remains topical.
Fabulous. How about you, Rachel?
Give that a go. I have read Hugo Rifkin's book, Rabbits, which he talked about last time he was on this show, so apologies for repeating it. But I hadn't had a chance to read it then because my husband had been hogging the copy that we've got. And I got to a Sunday night and I was just feeling overwhelmed with too much politics. And I started it on a Sunday night and I finished it by midday on the Monday. And for all of that time, I wasn't thinking about politics. I was thinking about raves in old country houses in rural Scotland and what it would have been like to have been a 90s teenager before smartphones. So that was proper escapism, completely unpolitical and really good fun.
How about you, Alex?
So I've been reading National Dish by Anya von Bremsen. Now, I read cookbooks like novels anyway. I genuinely sit down and read them cover to cover. But this actually does read like a novel. There is a prose narrative to it. So what she does is she charts the sort of parallels between food and national identity, how certain dishes and cuisines ebb and flow in popularity, how nations claim them as theirs or disown them as not theirs, how their links are underplayed or exaggerated, and how all this kind of weaves into the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. You know, you can chart every nation's history, and you can chart even the history of international relations and globalism just by looking at certain dishes. And she does that really extraordinarily well. It's a really cracking book.
And will you be cooking them?
I cook everything from everywhere all the time. Obviously not as they say, because
you give it your own spin.
Yeah, I can't even follow my own recipes, let alone other people's. When I write down my recipes, I go back to them and I think, that doesn't seem right. I think I want to put a bit more of that. So that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
And thank you, Seth. Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Wednesday with an extra episode and our usual edition out on Thursday ahead of the big day. All that remains is to say a big thanks to our much-loved Patreon backers, new and old.
Many thanks from me to Ed Clues, Fiona Allen, Taylor Harrington, Liz Sarkinson and Jane Harris.
And a grateful shout out from me to Alistair Hill, Richard Allport, Helen, Alan James and Richard Truscott.
And finally, a big hug from me for Dominique Johns and for returning supporters Andy Oldham, Colm Prunty, Justin Meadows and Benjamin Leach. Thanks for listening and we'll see you next time.